From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the Bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on them. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode,
literally the shape of our downtowns, the shape of many cities, individual property owners' relationships with state and federal governments were totally reshaped and conditioned by the Agnes response.
That's Andrew Stuhl, the environmental researcher from Bucknell University you may recall from earlier in this season. When natural disasters strike today, victims can count on a safety net to cushion their fall. You have the federal flood insurance program, which can help cover losses from water damage. You have the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to help coordinate the recovery and to compensate for the losses not covered by insurance. If enough homes are damaged, you might see temporary towns spring up with trailers to house the unhoused. We're so accustomed to the idea that help will be waiting for us that we kind of take it for granted.
We're doing everything we can. Where in the hell is the cavalry on this one?
Tropical Storm Agnes struck the Chesapeake Bay region in June of 1972. It wreaked havoc throughout the watershed, but especially in Pennsylvania, along the Susquehanna River. In the aftermath, this safety net was ill-defined and disorganized. The federally backed flood insurance program was only a few years old, and policies were few and far between. As for FEMA, it didn't exist yet. It would take 7 more years and a different Pennsylvania-based disaster for the federal bureaucracy to put an agency in charge of responding to emergencies. Agnes was America's largest natural disaster to that point. The devastation exposed flaws in the old ways of doing things and inspired new ways of grappling with disasters. Many of these innovations are still with us today, said Mike Builder, the Hurricane Program Manager for FEMA's Region 3, which includes the Mid-Atlantic.
Really, all these federal missions were disaster related, and there wasn't one entity that was organizing them. And Agnes really kind of highlighted that.
During this season of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're taking stock of Agnes. 2022 marked the storm's 50th anniversary, but in many ways, the effects of Agnes are still with us. With each episode, I'm exploring how we're still living in the world Agnes created. People still live with the emotional scars. Communities from Virginia up to New York still bear physical scars. And the Chesapeake Bay still bears environmental scars. We'll talk about why this still matters today and for our future. Every expert I talk to about insurance or emergency management would invariably tell me the same thing. You can't talk about modern disaster recovery without talking about Agnes. How did Agnes change the way we respond to crises? We'll dig into that, and then we'll examine a thornier problem. How do we respond to a crisis that isn't quite so immediate, but poses an even bigger threat? I'm talking about climate change, of course. A warming planet is churning up wilder weather on the east coast of the United States. We learn many lessons from Agnes about how to handle disasters. But as we face the prospect of more Agnes-like storms in the future, it's fair to ask, how ready are we? We'll talk about all this starting after a break. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you in part by Greenfin Studio, a marketing and communication firm focused on coastal, environmental, and social projects. They have helped hundreds of organizations engage new audiences and reach environmental goals. If your organization wants fresh ideas to expand your reach and deliver more effective messages, check them out at greenfinstudio.com. Welcome back. On today's episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're examining Agnes, the political storm. 1972 was an election year, and a rather monumental one at that. This was the year of the Watergate break-in, which set in motion the events that would lead to President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974. Pennsylvania was a swing state. Nixon and his campaign staffers knew that the strength of their response to Agnes could make or break his re-election. Here's Mike Bilder.
So a lot of attention in the Nixon White House to how we were responding to this big event.
During Agnes, Wilkes University, then known as Wilkes College, suffered widespread damage. 2 months after the storm and 2 months before the November election, Nixon paid a visit to the campus. The occasion was the presentation of a $4 million check to speed the school's recovery, and that was just the first installment.
For this check, which is badly needed to help us pay some bills. Thank you, Mr. President.
To make the payment possible, Congress and the White House had to amend the Disaster Relief Act to legalize the disbursement of relief funds to private schools.
Say one thing, Doctor, this check won't bounce.
Nixon wasn't content with simply handing out a check that day. At the beginning of the event, a local official mentioned to the assembled media that a gathering at the school the following day would provide hot dogs, but the public couldn't be invited because there weren't enough dogs to go around. Nixon abruptly chimed in.
What do you need more? You need more hot dogs or more...
We're short on hot
dogs.
There's a bit of back and forth, and then...
You're trying to feed 1,000, you got 900. That's only one per person. Nobody can want one hot dog. All right, we'll get it for you. Good luck.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll get it for you. Okay, admittedly this is a silly example, but I think it illustrates the state of affairs at the time. What Pennsylvania wanted, Pennsylvania would get. And the man who would get it for them was right by the president's side that day.
Mr. Carlucci, ladies and gentlemen.
Frank Carlucci.
I am very happy.
Builder again.
Now, some of your older listeners might remember that name because Frank Carlucci eventually went on to be one of President Reagan's secretaries of defense. But back then, he was working for another future Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld.
Rumsfeld and Carlucci had been roommates at Princeton University. Like Rumsfeld, Carlucci would carve out a career working in the upper echelons of various presidential administrations. He was an ambassador to Portugal under Ford, the deputy CIA director under Carter, the deputy secretary of defense, the national security advisor, and later secretary of defense under Reagan. But at the time of Agnes, Carlucci was a deputy director in Nixon's Office of Management and Budget. His background to that point was largely working overseas for the State Department. Why does Nixon appoint Carlucci to be his point person overseeing storm cleanup in the Mid-Atlantic?
And think about Frank Carlucci's from Scranton. So he's right up the road. And so Nixon's like, we need someone who knows that area, who works with them, and who's going to coordinate the federal efforts.
Heading up from D.C., Carlucci entered a political and logistical maelstrom. Dozens of federal agencies were on the ground and had made some headway. But with no one taking charge of the effort, gaps and redundancies were inevitable. Residents were frustrated, then furious. The issue came to a boil when Secretary of Housing and Urban Development George Romney, the father of current Utah Senator Mitt Romney, visited on August 9th. The meeting with local residents turned into a yelling match. Carlucci posted a sign outside his trailer turned office that read, "The President's Personal Representative." He held daily press conferences and kept open an hour each day for office hours. You may recall my interview from earlier this season with David DeCosmo, the radio reporter pressed into service as the public information officer for Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, site of some of the worst destruction. He remembers Carlucci as a tireless advocate for the region in Agnes's wake.
And he had President Nixon's ear. If there was something that was needed that had to go straight to the top, you went to Carlucci, and Carlucci went to President Nixon. And from the news media point of view, I think from the public point of view, Carlucci's door was always open. You could go in and ask him anything you wanted any time. If he had the answer, he'd give it to you. If he didn't have the answer, he'd try to get it for you.
3 months after assuming control, Carlucci had overseen the placement of more than 13,000 displaced people into mobile homes or campers. The Small Business Administration had loaned nearly $150 million to help people and businesses get back on their feet. About 1 out of every 7 shuttered stores had reopened, and about $350 million in federal money had been directed toward the estimated $1 billion cleanup in the Wyoming Valley of northeast Pennsylvania. One of the biggest victories during that period was Congress's passage of the Agnes Recovery Act. According to Agnes historian Gary Letcher, the legislation was historic.
Soon after Agnes, it was called the Agnes Recovery Act, was enacted within months, by August, spearheaded by a representative aptly named Daniel Flood. And his slogan was, "It takes a flood to beat a flood." Well, the Agnes Recovery Act gave grants and loans to victims, which was the first time this had been done in response to a national disaster. And that is now part of our standard responses to disasters.
In case you were wondering, Nixon only won 40% of the vote in Luzerne County in 1968. 4 years later, and 5 months after Agnes, he easily carried the county with 60% of the electorate. To be sure, there were many other variables at play besides Agnes, but the storm and the ensuing recovery don't seem to have dimmed the incumbent's chances. So, here in the wake of America's worst natural catastrophe, dozens dead, billions of dollars in damage, you start to see a paradigm shift in emergency management. With his genial competence, Frank Carlucci showed what could be accomplished by putting one person in charge. But this is still the federal government we're talking about. Things move slowly. So it took another 7 years after Agnes before FEMA was created, Builder told me.
Congress really started taking this question seriously of we need to do better federal emergency management. And so Agnes wasn't the last last disaster for this to really spurn them, but Agnes really got Congress to really start to think very critically about this idea, to the point where by the time he got to 1978, Carter at that point said, listen, I'm going to create effectively FEMA. And less than a year later is when 3 Mile Island happened up near Harrisburg. And the nuclear accident there. And so that is when Carter was like, here's my window of opportunity, and he created FEMA.
FEMA, of course, would face test after test over the years, and heavy criticism for its response to certain storms. Andrew in Florida, Katrina in Louisiana, Maria in Puerto Rico. Working for FEMA, Builder said, means expecting the unexpected.
Eisenhower said it best. Plans are nothing. Planning is everything. It's that human element. It's an activity beforehand, understanding. And so, there are probably things that we think we know from Agnes, and they're going to get tested when we get the next Agnes, the next Lee, or the next 1936. And, time will tell as to whether we can truly, surmount some of those, challenges.
Especially in a climate changing world, right?
Yeah, the inland flooding side, or the heavy rainfall element, is something that we should be very concerned about with respect to climate change in the eastern United States. It's the thing that it's definitely going to be a much more of an acute threat for our part of the country when it comes to how climate change can be changing how we're dealing with things. So we're seeing more of these extreme rainfall events, and we still have the same cities and towns on hills and pavement, everything like that. So we're seeing more of this stuff, and that's having these type of Agnes events is something we gotta, that's something we have to be even more prepared for as we grapple with climate change.
FEMA wasn't the only wholesale change that grew out of the Agnes experience. You may be aware that typical homeowners insurance does not cover damage caused by flooding. It was this way in Agnes's day as well, and the vast majority of people in harm's way didn't have that type of coverage, DeCosmo recalled.
During the flood, when there was the water is all over the place, we saw a couple fires break out. And a couple of us commented, boy, they're lucky. Why were they lucky? Because they had fire insurance. Nobody had flood insurance.
Well, almost nobody had flood insurance. That had a lot to do with the fact that Congress had only created the National Flood Insurance Program in 1968, 4 years before Agnes. Congress had been motivated by the widespread flooding caused by Hurricane Betsy along the Gulf Coast in 1965. For the first time, federally subsidized insurance was available to help people recover from flood losses. But it was a tough sell.
There wasn't a lot of interest in flood insurance at that point. We were just getting the program underway in Pennsylvania.
Kerry Wilson was the National Flood Insurance Coordinator for Pennsylvania in 1972. Part of his job was to consult with homeowners and help guide them on coverage decisions. But the other part of his job was even more important. You see, when people think about the National Flood Insurance Program, if they think about it at all, they tend to focus on the insurance part. But the original 1968 law contained a second, equally important objective.
The program itself is both an economic program in that flood insurance is provided to individuals and private sector individuals, but it's also a community program where the community has certain responsibilities in terms of floodplain management and controlling development, regulating or guiding development, I might say, in floodplain areas.
So you have the federal government backing flood insurance coverage, but before a single policy could be written in a certain city or town, that community must have taken actions to limit development in its most flood-prone areas.
Officials had to take formal action to commit to the program through resolutions and ordinances adopted.
And only once your community had become a certified participant in the program could you, as the individual property owner, purchase the new insurance. Wilson recalled visiting countless city halls and rec centers to explain the program to local officials, but many places just weren't equipped to start regulating development, he said.
In Pennsylvania, a lot of communities didn't even issue planning or building permits or zoning permits.
And even if they had the tools and staff at their disposal, some communities were unwilling to undertake any measures that they felt might step on people's private property rights.
So you weren't necessarily greeted as a hero in these communities.
That's true. It was a lot of resentment on the part of communities thinking that we were infringing on their rights to do what they wanted or let people do what they wanted. So we'd have to provide the other side of the coin that, hey, this is something that involves the public safety and the welfare of the community. So it's a legitimate use of local government.
Around the time of Agnes, Wilson said, only 90 localities in Pennsylvania were officially on board with the federal program. And even in participating communities, individuals weren't exactly breaking down the door to get signed up. In hard-hit Wilkes-Barre, only 2 policies were in force during Agnes. In Harrisburg, there were 0. Surely something needed to be done. After Agnes, Congress got to work, Stuhl said. With revisions to the flood insurance program in 1973, property owners with federally backed mortgages in flood-prone areas were now required to purchase flood insurance as a condition of receiving federal disaster assistance.
It basically lays out what we now know in our rivers and waterways. Is if you are going to remain in the 100-year floodplain, you must purchase insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage or loan.
Today, nearly all of those communities now participate, Wilson said. Their residents are free to sign up for flood insurance, but
We're still undercovered with the flood insurance program. I think today it was estimated after Agnes that in the late 70s, a study was done that identified as possibly 150,000 homeowners should have flood insurance. Today, we only have 50,000 covered.
Maybe we haven't learned our lessons from Agnes after all. One of the persistent criticisms of the National Flood Insurance Program is that it incentivizes what the insurance industry calls perverse behavior. In this case, you could actually get more development in floodplains because insurance provides some sense of security. A recent overhaul of the program, called Risk Rating 2.0, aims to bring premiums more in line with actual flood risk. So, if you're at higher risk, you pay more, and lower risk properties will see their premiums go down. As Stool sees it, the change has the potential to bring better balance between two competing priorities: private property rights on the one hand, and making people responsible for their own decisions on the other.
It just is the clearest accounting of responsibility. And as we protect people's right to live where they want to live, we need to have them fully knowledgeable. If they choose to remain in the floodplain, this is the risk that you bear.
And because of climate change, more people and more properties are at risk today than they were in Agnes's day, said Elizabeth Andrews. She's the director of the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at the William & Mary Law School. Recall from Season 1, the Mid-Atlantic is one of the most vulnerable places in the country because not only are the seas rising here, but the land is sinking at the same time.
We have this unfortunate situation of the land going down and the water going up. You would like to have the opposite. Looking at our record of what's happened in the past may not be the best reference for what's going to be in the future as this rate accelerates. So the big lesson is to make sure that we look at the risks today and talk about the risks today, and don't wait for a big storm event, some terrible emergency event to force us to have the conversation. Plan today while we can for the increasing amount of water that we're experiencing.
Agnes underscored the importance of planning. It's been 50 years, and several more large storms have tested America's communities. Well, now we face perhaps our biggest threat. What can Agnes teach us as we prepare for climate change? We'll talk about that after this last break.
Hi, this is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
Hello again. Today on Chesapeake Uncharted, we're looking at Tropical Storm Agnes's enduring policy legacy, how the storm inspired changes to property insurance and emergency management. For our last segment, let's look to the future. Officials and residents in Norfolk in southeastern Virginia are deliberating over a $2.6 billion plan to rescue the city from sea level rise and storms. Agnes caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage to Virginia, but Norfolk was largely spared from the worst of it. With climate change, it won't be so lucky.
These are certainly things that are not future issues for Norfolk. It's very much a now issue.
Andrea McClellan is a Norfolk City Councilwoman who has made fighting climate change one of her top priorities. Over the past century, the water level has risen by a foot in the Chesapeake region. In a place that lies as low as Norfolk, flooding has become a regular nuisance.
What you're seeing now is, a couple of times, 2, 3, 4 times a year now, the city is having to open up our parking garages for folks who don't have off-street parking so people can protect their cars. If you use Waze or Google Maps, it will tell you where the flooding is. I mean, this is just a It's becoming more and more of a regular occurrence.
The city, in collaboration with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, envisions employing just about every flood fix in the book to tackle the problem. Raised houses, living shorelines, flood walls, tide gates, levees, reconstructed wetlands, infilled basements. It's an impressive amount of investment, but some residents are already raising concerns about whether the plan is equitable. Last month, that pressure prompted Mayor Kenneth Alexander to delay a vote formalizing the partnership with the Corps. In my interview with McClellan, which took place some time before that postponement, she acknowledged that the government can't buy protection for everyone, but she stressed that the plan wouldn't leave behind underprivileged areas.
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be concerns because there are going to be people who are behind a flood wall and those who aren't, because we just can't protect everything. That said, the first phase that we are focused on is specifically being created to protect this massive redevelopment that we're doing in an area that had some of our poorest folks. We're creating mixed income, but there's going to be a lot of workforce housing and project-based voucher housing right there. And so we're literally, the very first part of the project is to protect that area.
As we chatted, I got to thinking about Agnes and how problems still linger in its wake. Emergency management, flood insurance, we still see shortcomings with both. How do you combat a long-term issue like climate change in this world of quarterly financial reports and quadrennial elections?
I've got to quote Congressman Bobby Scott, who said to me once, and it's so true, long-term issues don't have constituents. People are more focused on, rightly so, the issues that are right in front of them. Issues, whether it's gun violence or our schools or the pothole on your street or the fact that the street light is out. And these are existential threats that are so enormous, and the amount of money required and time required to implement these changes are significant. And to find the political will is often difficult. And I mean, we all know the parable of the frog in the pot of boiling water, where frogs put in this pot and the burner's turned on or the fire is lit, and he's like, yeah, it's no problem, it's cold, oh, it's a little bit warm, and then before it's too late, it's scalding him and boiling him to death. And I feel like we're living in this pot of boiling water, and it's starting to get warmer, and if we don't get started now, it's going to be too late.
Greenfin Studio combines creative design, strategic marketing, and scientific expertise to deliver for our clients. Visit greenfinstudio.com to view their portfolio and ask them how they can help you. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at bayjournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.